Hey folks, Matt Easton here, Scholar Gladiatoria. Now, I've spoken a lot in the past about 19th century warfare and the effectiveness, or not effectiveness, shall we say, ineffectiveness of firearms. Now, very clearly, we have to put this into a wider setting and understand that the 19th century really saw a huge development in firearms of all sorts, whether it's artillery or rifles or pistols. But in particular, I'm often looking at close combat when I'm looking at particularly personal narratives, personal accounts, first-hand accounts of close combat, because I'm primarily looking at hand-to-hand combat, particularly with swords and bayonets and lances and things like this. Now, we have to remember that that is a selective process, because of course if I'm looking for sources which talk about hand-to-hand combat, why does hand-to-hand combat happen? Well, because missile combat has sometimes or somehow failed. So quite simply, if I'm looking through accounts, and then we could call this source bias, okay, and I think lots of people will refer to it as that. If I'm looking for sources which talk about where bayonets were used, well then very clearly it's for a reason that that missile fire, rifle fire, for some reason didn't suit that particular scenario. For example, storming into buildings where with something like, if I just grab one, if with something like a Martini Henry rifle like this, that's right, I do just have a Martini Henry down here, with something like a Martini Henry, you've got to, in fact I'll show it rather than talking about it, if I'm storming into a building, for example, to take that building from some enemy, then I've got to open my breech, I've got to reach into my ammo pouch, take a round out, stuff it into the breech of my rifle, close the breech, and then I'm ready to fire, and then I've got to do that again. Now, if I'm storming into a building, for example, then clearly that takes a certain amount of time and coordination and thought and looking down and reaching, fumbling around for rounds and this kind of thing. So yeah, absolutely, I might go in with a loaded rifle, one shot, but then after that, a bayonet on the end of my rifle is probably going to be quicker and easier for defending myself or taking ground than actually just loading another round and standing there, or even if I'm trying to do it while moving and shooting. Equally, if we go to revolvers, for example, so if we're talking about officers who are using a revolver in one hand and a sword in the other, whatever type of sword, doesn't really matter, I'll just grab a tulwar. So they, at this point, have a weapon which they can offend and defend with, and a very effective weapon for offending. But even in that scenario, let's put the tulwar back, even in that scenario, when we're reading about sources where the sword gets used, it's very often because for some reason the revolver didn't do the entire job. Now, that, as I've said in previous videos, there could be many reasons. It doesn't mean there's anything wrong with the revolver. It could simply be that I've run out of ammunition. This Beaumont Adams only has 5 shots. When those 5 shots are gone, if I'm in close combat, if I'm in any kind of combat actually, I might not have time to reload. So at that point, you just have to carry on with the sword, don't you? So coming around to what I want to read to you is an original account, and this is featured in Man-Stopper Mania, which is the new book. I highly recommend, I'll stick a link below obviously, by D.A. Kinsley, and this is a collection of accounts talking about the use of firearms, particularly in close combat, it has to be said, and not so much in ranged combat. And there are lots of accounts in here which show the sometimes ineffectiveness of firearms in the 19th century. Now, as I say, there is a source bias involved here. We've got to remember that the vast majority of warfare in the 19th century was conducted with firearms, artillery and muskets and rifles and pistols and carbines, and they did cause most of the combat casualties. I say combat casualties because of course a lot of the soldier casualties were caused by things like the weather, getting cold, disease, that's this type of thing, accidents, falling off walls and this kind of stuff. But in terms of combat, absolutely, firearms and artillery caused the most number of casualties. We shouldn't, overinflate the fact that swords and bayonets did also kill people, but they probably didn't kill people in the same numbers, certainly in conflict where Western forces were involved anyway, maybe in between certain groups in Asia or Africa, then firearms played a lesser part, but certainly where Europeans, British, French, Italians, whatever were involved, firearms did most of the work, as it were. But nevertheless, there is an account here which I think is worth reciting to you, and it's by Major B.A. Coombe, and it's from Letters from BAC, who is B.A. Coombe, of 1880, and he was the Deputy Assistant Quartermaster General of the Kabul Field Force in 1880. So between 1878 through to about 1881, the British Army was active in Afghanistan for various reasons I won't go into. And he says, I quote, "I don't believe in revolvers," I'll just grab one, "I don't believe in revolvers at all. A lot of these fanatics who mean business would take all 5 or 6 charges and yet get home with their knives, though they probably would die directly afterwards." Knives, first of all, I thought I've got all of the things that he's talking about here, so I will show. This is the type of knife that he's referring to, the so-called Khyber knife, known locally in India and Afghanistan as a chura or chara. Or if you're watching Forged in Fire, a charay. I don't know where they got that pronunciation from, but anyway, chara. It's a large knife, T-section blade, very effective weapon, but clearly you've got to get in close with it. Now I should mention the Afghans or Pathans or Afridi that the British Army in this case were fighting against were very often not very well armed. Okay, so we have to be honest about that. The British Army was much better armed, much better trained for the most part, not always necessarily better motivated, because as you see there he refers to fanatics, so a lot of these were fanatical warriors who were prepared to die, whereas of course the British soldiers were there to do their job and hopefully go home, get paid, and be able to afford a new pair of boots or something. So different motivations, obviously attacking, defending, different roles, different scenarios for each of those combatants. But if you were a fanatic, as he calls them, but if you were someone defending your homeland in Afghanistan with nothing but a Khyber knife, maybe if you were lucky you had some type of firearm like a Jezail, single shot muzzle loader, or matchlock, then you would fire your gun and then you'd charge in with one of those Khyber knives. So quite simply, you've got to get to close range, you've got to ignore the shooting that's coming in, because if you want to stand any chance of defeating a British force in the field in 1880, then you've got to come to close combat basically, unless you've got superior firearms and more of them preferably, which most opponents of the British Army didn't have until the Boer War. Okay, so going back to his count, several officers had narrow escapes and declared that they fired all the barrels, 5 or 6, he means chambers incidentally, of their revolvers into the men without the slightest effect. Okay, so that's kind of weird. You think, well, how can that be possible? How can they be firing their revolvers into opponents and them not taking effect? Well, there's many possibilities. I think that a lot of these counts, essentially the officers were missing. Okay, so I think if we kind of balance the odds, if we said, why is this happening in a lot of different accounts, and there are quite a lot of accounts that are similar to this, then I think most of the time it's because the people are missing. They think, well, I'm quite a good shot on the range, I must be hitting them. But if you're moving, if the opponent's moving, you're under stress, you're perhaps a bit scared, you're trying to command men at the same time if you're an officer, so you've got other things in your mind, and I think that most of these shots were missing. But here is an account written in 1888 from, it's a quote taken from Arming of Gunners and Drivers, Proceedings of the Royal Artillery Institution, 1888. And it's referring to an account of something that happened in 1879, and it's by Major Eden Baker of the Royal Artillery. And now this is a situation where it wasn't that the bullets missed, and we'll talk about this as we go through it. So he says, "I remember an instance which will illustrate what a service revolver cannot do." This was a British service revolver of the time, which was, I think, probably an Enfield at that date. In 1879, I saw Captain Harvey of the Bengal Cavalry empty 5 barrels, again he means chambers, and it could have been a Beaumont Adams converted to cartridge, into the back of a Ghazi. So a Ghazi, let's say fanatical warrior who was running amok through the camp. So this is again in Afghanistan, incidentally. So this guy was running through the camp going, probably with a sword, maybe something like that, pulwar up there. Could have been with a Khyber knife. He was running amok through the camp and at less than 5 yards without stopping him. So he shot into the back of this guy 5 times with something akin to this from 5 yards away. So almost point blank range, really. 5 times, bam, 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 bam. Bearing in mind, British revolvers were usually double action, so you can just squeeze the trigger, you don't need to cock the hammer each time, without stopping him. A Martini Henry bullet pierced him as well, and yet he kept on until he was brought up by an infantry bayonet. So even this guy had had 5 rounds from a revolver like that and a round from a Martini Henry. I mean, these were 45 caliber, but a large charge of black powder behind them. So it was a 5.77 round that narrowed down to 4.55 bullet. And they were, Martini Henrys were known for the nasty wounds they would give. They were big, heavy, soft lead round that would, make a mess of people. So this guy was shot 5 times by a revolver, 1 time by a Martini Henry. That also, incidentally, reminds you of the firing rate possible with a Martini Henry in close combat. There was only 1 shot from a Martini Henry rifle. And he was brought up, in other words, stopped by an infantry bayonet. So despite the fact he was shot and he was obviously certainly gonna die, but he wasn't stopped, he wasn't physically stopped until brought up by a bayonet. And this is one of the points I've tried to make in a lot of my videos, is that guns can shoot people, but they don't necessarily drop people or stop people straight away. So if someone's going crazy, then shooting them several times might work, but it might not. Whereas a hand weapon, like whether it's even a stick or a sword or a knife or a bayonet or something like this, will physically block and will physically stop. It's a very different type of thing, despite the fact it might be far less fatal to that person. Baker goes on to say, I examined the man afterwards myself and found the marks of all 6 bullets, so 5 revolver, 1 rifle, in his body. So there is a specific case of where it wasn't a question of people missing. He'd been hit by 6 shots and he was only finally stopped by a bayonet. So there we go. I highly recommend this book. It's full of, it's not a huge book, as you can see, but it is full of quite a lot of accounts like this. Very, very interesting. And from each one of these accounts, we can gain several bits of information, and taken as a whole, taken in conjunction, they provide quite a lot of, quite a kind of 360-degree perspective, I think, on the topic. But remember that the vast majority of 19th century warfare, certainly involving Western forces, was done with firearms, and they did do most of the killing. So there is source bias here, but you have to accept that and read it in that context nevertheless. So, Man Stopper Mania by D.A. Kinsley, link below. I did contribute a very short prologue for it. So I have been slightly involved. Thank you to D.A. Kinsley for allowing me again to be involved with one of his projects. I'm very honoured to be, and I think they're very worthwhile. They're standalone. I don't know anyone else who's doing these sorts of books. They are wonderful things, and of course, Swordsman of the British Empire and all of the other iterations of his books which involve close combat accounts are also available through Lulu Books. Anyway, thanks for watching. I hope that's been interesting and given a little bit more context to close combat where firearms are involved, particularly in the 19th century. But you could apply a lot of this to the 17th and 18th centuries, and possibly the 20th and 21st as well. Cheers, folks. Thanks for watching. We've got extra videos on Patreon. Please give our Facebook a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Cheers, folks.